So yeah, what I was going to say, so after we've done all of that, and then I was going to say to you, you're not actually part of any of that. You're one.
No.
So
Well, tradition.
You chose not to be, or your family did.
We chose not to be. So my great-grandmother entered in the DOCG Chianti Colli Senesi in 1967 when it was founded. So historically, we are actually one of the first winery of the Chianti Colli Senesi appellation. And then my parents decided to leave the DOCG in 2008 because things have changed. So maybe I should say a little bit the way how we work in order to understand why we label as IGT Toscana. So since the beginning, my mother decided to work in a low intervention way. This means by doing spontaneous fermentation, our wines are not filtered, are not clarified, there is no use of pesticides, herbicides, or any chemicals in the countryside. So we could say a natural way of making wine. We prefer, say, a traditional way of making wine, because wine has been made in this way for a very long time. And then at some point, the technological processes became more and more important on the winemaking than the traditional style of making wine. And my mother started making wine, as I mentioned earlier, in this way at the end of the 80s. But if I'm honest, Pācina has never changed making wine. So when the family got the place in 1933, there were already vineyards and the family was already making wine. Instead, my great-grandmother entered in the DOCG in the 1967 when my mother wasn't even born, and she was making wine. She was making wine and she was selling actually the wine to Rufina, because the wines from the southern part of Chianti were sold very, very well, because the southern part of Chianti has much more concentration, has much more color, has much more alcohol. And before, when the temperature weren't so high, this was something that the wineries from the northern part of Chianti were looking for. So the wine from the southern part of Chianti were very well paid in order to mix with the other Chiantis and make a more balanced wine that was not so stringy, let's say. And so we never, and in that, the history in a way developed for Pācina, and we didn't really change the way of making wine. But at some point, the DOCG really changed the rules. So now, by making very low intervention wine, this means that we come from an area that has a very high concentration on the Sangiovese. So these are wines that need quite a long time to be ready and to be stable. Now we are out with 2014. So we age our wines for 6 years, 7 years sometimes. And Chianti Colli Senesi decided to have a policy of young bulk wine. So we were comparing and we were discussing with the other wineries that were, releasing the wine the year after the harvest or 2 years after the harvest, while we were waiting for a very long time. So we were making completely two different products. And we had a very different idea of what was the characteristic of our region. And this was the reason why we left the DOCG. So I always say that we might enter again in the DOCG at some point in the future. For us, was a very tough decision to leave it, because we were one of the first winery there. But it's a DOCG that a little bit follow a trend. At some point, it was more necessary to make young wine and to release it very early. And so they did it in that way, without thinking of what was the culture and the historical idea of Sangiovese from the southern part of Chianti.